All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're so happy and honored to have Lucrecia Prat today joining us. We know most of you guys, I'm sure, know her already. I remember attending Lucrecia's first seminar in Tucumán when I was super young. I was still a student at university. So I know everyone probably know you, Lucre. So she is a neuroscience psychology educator, practitioner. She has been certified by the University of Harvard. She also does a lot of research and gets her input from CASEL, which is on social and emotional learning program. She is also the author of a great book called The Brain-Based Learning, right? No, what is the name of the book? I'm sorry.
My book is called From Passion to Action.
I was reading the reviews and everything, so I'm sure I'll be reading it. And, Lucrecia has also presented nationally and internationally as she's an expert in neuroscience. So Lucre, with that being said, the floor is yours. And, thank you so much for honoring us with your presence.
Thank you so much, Lorena, for this invitation to talk about one of my passions, which is reading. And I hope you can take home some practical tips to make your classes or your life more brain compatible through storytelling. So if you're okay, I'll go straight to my presentation. Hold on, I'm touching the wrong buttons. There we go. Sharing the screen. Okay. I'll assume that you are, unless Lorena says the opposite, I assume you can see me and you can hear me and that everything is okay. So
yes,
the idea
everything
today,
is great. Great.
Right. The idea is to tell whatever you teach with a story, tell it with a story, because stories are brain compatible tools. So I'll be explaining a little bit what I mean by being brain compatible tool, that we are able to explore brains nowadays without having to wait for the owner of the brain to die. This is thank you to non-invasive technology. So there's a lot of research I can share now that confirms how powerful a story is, especially when you're talking about a learning process. So let me go straight to the point. I want you to close your eyes if you want, or you may stay awake. If you're afraid, you may fall asleep. But the idea is for you to see how can you connect to this wonderful starting sentence. Once upon a time, and just to allow your mind to play with the different ideas, with the different senses that are activated when you hear once upon a time. If there is a special person that pops up, a special place, remember being the storyteller, or you remember being a child and listening to a story before going to bed. So basically, I wanted to start with the experience of how stories can help us think and feel about ourselves. Just by listening to the opening sentence, the once upon a time, el érase una vez, we can already fly to some place, maybe a place that we haven't visited for a long time. And stories always have a way of connecting to our own selves, to where we come from and where we are going to. This is from Howard Gardner. He has he's famous for his theory of multiple intelligences, and also for the description of the language intelligence, where I would say stories fit in, but stories fit in also with our intrapersonal intelligence, with our interpersonal intelligence. So the first thing that I believe stories are useful for is to kind of open up whatever is kept inside our brains and inside our hearts. And it is a good idea because we already know from neurosciences that we can't learn without emotions. So emotions are necessary for the learning process. The agenda for today, these are the 4 things I would like to do with you today in this hour we are going to be together. I would like to convince you that stories are brain compatible tools. When we say brain compatible, it means that a story is something organic, is something memorable, is something that mirrors the way the brain learns. So when we use stories, what we are doing is bringing the content that we need to teach through a media that is very friendly for the organ that is going to be doing the learning. I'm going to talk about some reading strategies that you're probably all using, but we'll go over them. And I also want to insist on telling stories as a way of developing critical thinking. Hopefully, we will have time for rounding off and a recapping. So this is our agenda for today. And let's begin with this beautiful painting. These are cave paintings, and it's a way of reminding all of us here that stories have been amongst us for forever. Telling stories has been one of humankind ways of sharing information throughout history. So we've always been telling stories even before language existed. And stories create emotional connections, and this makes it easier to recall information and to store memories. So when you are a teacher, what you want is students to remember the content you're teaching. And one way to do it is through stories, because stories are more memorable than isolated data. So whenever we tell whatever it is we need to teach in a story, we know that it will be easier to recall and it will be easier to store in the long-term memory. I remember reading a book by Steve Jobs on leadership and how he had already learned a lot about neurosciences. So he always told a story of how the product that he was selling on that particular presentation, how the story behind the product brought the product to life, because he knew that telling stories, even when you're selling products, is what makes the experience more compelling. So these are some of the effects of storytelling. Stories can entertain you. They can elicit change. I remember teaching Hamlet in secondary school and discussing the eternal doubt that Hamlet has throughout the 2 hours or 3 hours of the play, in which he doesn't know, should I kill Claudius or should I not? So reading about somebody who doesn't make up his mind and in the end tragically ends up dead is one way of thinking about ourselves in terms of how long does it take me to make a decision? Maybe now that I hear the story, I can start thinking about being more prompt, about trying to make up my mind in a shorter period of time. So stories and characters always are a big force that elicit change in us. We can also read stories that warn us or that teach us stuff, that make us laugh, feel angry, cry. I finished watching Netflix last season of Bridgerton, Charlotte, and I experienced all these emotions and more. And it is a compelling story. And basically, apart from entertaining, apart from warning us, we all know that stories can be very powerful learning experiences. So before I move on, let me tell you my story as to why I started studying brain science. because there is a story behind that. The story is very private, but I think I can share it with you. When I was 27 years old, I suffered from a very severe form of depression. And therefore, I was deeply concerned about how the brain had got ill and how I could prevent that from happening in the rest of my life. So I was drawn into learning about neurosciences because of a very personal experience. So there is a story behind my passion for the brain and learning, something I've been doing for the last 22 years of my life. Now think about all the stories you have to tell about why you are teaching, why you became a mom, why you moved to whatever place you're living now. There's always a story behind these big critical moments of our lives. So I'm going to move into the favorite topic, which is the brain. And I brought Woody Allen here to make it a little bit humorous. Apparently, this is a quote from Woody Allen saying, yeah, my brain, that's my second favorite organ. So we're going to be talking about the second favorite organ that Woody Allen mentions, and I'm leaving it to your imagination, which may be the first favorite organ. But we're going to be talking about why telling stories is a good idea from the scientific point of view, okay? So basically, this is a brain, and this is a brain as well. And we need to know what parts of your brain are activated when you're listening to a story, when you're telling a story. So these three structures in the brain are critical to memory formation and to learning. Your prefrontal cortex, this and your cortex, have to do with cognition and with understanding and with executive functions, with your ability to analyze, to compare, to contrast, to be able to model very intense emotions. And then in the back door of your brain, you have your emotional system, your limbic system. And inside your emotional system, you have this tiny almond-shaped structure called amygdala that is responsible for coding information that has to do with your emotions and how you feel. Now, this is very important because your amygdala is like the first, let's say, the first post in which the information that you are teaching to your students is decoded. And then your amygdala sends it to hippocampus, where you start making memories. The hippocampus used to be, people thought before the non-invasive technology, we used to think that hippocampus was responsible for long-term memories, that now we know that it's only like a relay station for long-term memory. And long-term memory resides in our prefrontal cortex here. So it's very important to understand that whatever we store here first began in our emotional brain. And this is why stories are so powerful, because they immediately turn on our emotional brain. And when you're learning, we already know that both cognition and emotion are crucial to learning. You don't learn anything unless you're interested about it, unless you feel some kind of commitment or emotion. Whatever is boring, you don't learn. Whatever feels too difficult or too stressed, you don't learn. So emotions are one way of also relaxing your emotional brain so that you can be able to imagine, to create, to feel part of the story. And the other lovely thing that stories do in your brains is they produce something called Angel's Cocktail. I didn't even know about this until one of the last research that I came up with when I was preparing this talk. And I like the name. Apparently, when these three chemicals are released, we call it the Angel's Cocktail, because these are like the chemicals of well-being. And apparently when you're listening to a story and when you're reading a story, your brain releases dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocins. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that aids neural formation. So basically, dopamine is what you need to be able to turn on your cognition and make connections, make synapses. But also dopamine has to do with your attention span, with the ability of being motivated, etc. Serotonin has to do with pleasure, but the kind of pleasure that arrives after doing an effort for something. It's like when you finally graduate, then your brain is filled with serotonin. It's like, wow, I made it. And oxytocin is the hormone of empathy. Oxytocin is what mothers release when they're expecting a baby, and the day they deliver the baby, their brain is bathed in oxytocin, which makes us love that baby from the very first second until we don't even know him or her. So this kind of cocktail is the one you serve when you are telling a story and when you're listening to a story. And all these hormones of well-being are ideal to make or to put your emotional brain into the right dial for learning. So let me give you a couple of examples using stories. I love the story of Sense and Sensibility, so I chose this extract from it because it has to do also with what neuroscience says after many, many years of research. Be soft. Do not let the world make you hard. Do not let the pain make you hate. Do not let the bitterness steal your sweetness. Take pride that even though the rest of the world may disagree, you still believe it to be a beautiful place. Now, of course, when this book was written, they knew almost nothing about brain science. But today, this is exactly so. We can feel good even in a toxic work environment. We can feel good even surrounded by people who are evil, who are nasty, who are not generous. We can choose our own emotional climate. And also this talks about optimism. And there is a lot of research, especially coming from Martin Seligman, who's been studying for 30 years the brains of pessimistic people and optimistic people, and explaining how optimism is a choice. And you can still choose to believe wherever it is you are living and wherever it is you are working right now, that that place can be the best place if you set your mind to it. But the reason I'm telling you the story of Sense and Sensibility is because I'm also comparing it to the brain. There is a part of us that is more logical, and there is another part of our brain that is more sensitive. And both hemispheres are turned on when we are listening a story, which is fantastic. So whenever we are telling a story, whether it is a story about some historical character, or we are telling a story about science or whatever it is, we need to understand that the entire brain is activated. This is why it is a good idea to teach through stories. Okay? And the other thing that is very interesting is that the hemispheres have a different purposes. For example, your right hemisphere has more white matter, and white matter is what you need when you want to connect bigger concepts, whereas the gray matter is the kind of matter that you need when you want to handle detail. And the interesting thing is that when you're listening to a story, you're turning on both your gray and your white matter. So it's always a good idea whenever you have to teach, even if it's the first time conditional or whatever it is, try to make a story around it. And finally, the other reason why stories are brain compatible is because they set your mind into what we call alpha waves. And the alpha waves, you know that your brain is almost like a radio, and it works with different wavelengths. And apparently when we are listening to a story, when we're telling a story, what we are activating is our alpha brain waves, which are the waves of relaxed awareness. It is when we are feeling comfortable in our own skins, but at the same time, we are awakened. We are not too relaxed. We are not too sleepy, and we are not too alert. We are not anxious. We are not worried. So these are the kind of brain waves that facilitate learning. So it's ideal to tell a story because you know that whatever comes after the story will be using this alpha wave that triggers the unconscious mind and produces feelings of well-being. And in this state, we can allow our minds to experience heightened concentration. So these brain waves are also related to paying sustained attention. So stories are also helping us to bring about our own intrinsic motivation and our own desire to concentrate on the story, the characters, the climate, and so on. Sorry about that. Now, I've been talking for too long now. Let's make a brain break. A brain break is a pause between instruction and instruction. When should we have these pauses? It depends. It depends on how old you are. It depends on how interested you are in the topic. It depends on how hungry you are. It depends on the fact that you had a row with your mother before coming to work. So attention span depends on many, many things. But to generalize, if you have a Zoom meeting every 20, 30 minutes, you should be making a pause to allow brains on the other side of the screen to recover the energy that they have just spent paying attention. So what are we going to do now? I am going to recap everything I said so far. Some of you are already panicking, and we are going to do it with a true and false activity with music. So every time you see a statement on the screen, you will have to think whether it is true or false. If it is true, you're going to raise your arms. And if it is false, you are going to wiggle your body. Okay, so true and false. Ready? I'm going to play the music to activate.
I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to
What do you think about this?
I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it.
Only the emotional brain is activated.
You like to move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. You like to
Stories can help memory formation. What do you
original
think?
man, stop man, pon your case, man. I love how all girls are move them body.
Cocktail
And when you move your body,
and listening to
wanna move it
stories
nice and sweet
activates
and
the
sexy.
stress
Alright,
hormone.
woman you cute, I don't need no makeup. Original cute body, you want me
Finally.
talk, woman you cute, I don't need no makeup. Original cute body, you want me talk, woman physically fit, physically fit, physically. Woman, I like
Let's
to
go
move.
back to these and check them out to see if you knew the correct answer. Stories build emotional connections. The entire brain is activated through storytelling, not only the emotional brain, but also the cognitive brain that is trying to follow the plot of the story, trying to compare the characters to their own selves. Stories aid memory formation because they involve the hippocampus and the amygdala, and they release a combination of chemicals that activate well-being, not the stress response. The entire brain is involved in storytelling, and the waves, the wavelength that our brain is set to when you're listening to a story is alpha waves, not beta waves, okay? So I hope you moved a little bit and you're ready to move on to the second point of our agenda. So the first one, I was trying to convince you to use stories because they are very brain compatible tools. And then we are going to talk about some ways in which you can use stories by doing pre-activities and post-activities and during activities, okay? And hopefully you are going to work with me. This is a cartoon that I found, it was almost 20 years ago when we were starting to talk about the PCs, the personal computers. I just want to put this up and have you thinking about it. Do you still believe that America's most popular laptop is a book? What do you think about this? Take a couple of seconds to think about this. Do people only read books that are paper bound? Or do people read a lot, but not necessarily from, you know, textbooks, but also from Kindle, from the computer? I want you to think about this. Now, I believe that possibly today, 2023, the most popular laptop is not a good book. Probably the most popular laptop is the PC, the computer. But the good thing is that students and grown-ups are still reading stories, although maybe they are not reading it in the paper form in which everybody has grown up reading. Before I used to say I will never give in to reading stories in the computer. And of course I gave in, because it's very comfortable to have thousands of books in the same small mini iPad. Let's move on from the cartoon into why stories are also metaphors of life, and we should be fed stories as medicine for the mind. The nice thing about telling a story, I'm always reminded of The Little Prince, and how when you read The Little Prince in primary school, you understand The Little Prince and you can enjoy it. And you don't know that you're enjoying it on a surface level. You don't know that there is a lot more to learn about The Little Prince. But when you read it in secondary school, or when you reread it when you are an adult, you understand there was so much in there when he talks about the rose, when he talks about friendship and the fox, and you start understanding that there are so many layers in a story, and that they help you because they offer you a parallel of life. What happens to you when you fall in love? Do you take care of love as the Little Prince took care of the rose? What happens when you fight with a friend and you don't see that friend anymore? Do you feel that you have to tame your friend again, like the Little Prince tamed the fox? So stories are always compelling because they talk about ourselves. They talk about human problems and human joy, and you can get the gist of it maybe on a surface level when you are very young, when you start from preschool and primary. But as you move on into adulthood, you start understanding all the other wonderful things behind the story. So what do you do with a story now that we know that they are useful? We have some reading strategies that are ideal to hook children and grown-ups into reading. Things you can do before reading a story and things you can do after reading the story. Some of them we will do today, some of them for another life, because I don't have time today, okay? So let's start with an example of what you can do before reading the story. I know that the sad thing in schools is that children already know the title of the book, they already bought it or they already have it. But ideally, if you do this activity in the classroom, maybe you can do it with the screen, with your PowerPoint, and show them the cover of a book without the title, so they can start predicting what the title can be about, looking at the drawing on the cover. So I'm asking you, and please share with me if you want, and on your mic, or write it in the chat box. What do you think is going on in this cover? Have a look at it. What can you see would be the first question, and what questions are arousing would be the second one.
Don't want to spoil. Don't want to spoil people.
Lore, what do you see? What's going on there?
I see somebody celebrating something because there's champagne, it looks like. And, you know, celebration time for something.
Terrific. So you are relating the popping of the champagne with some kind of celebration. Okay, we have people sharing with us also. Margarita says a bottle, I believe it's a bottle of champagne. Lourdes says 2 fish. Lourdes is seeing 2 fish. Then Abigail is wondering, does it take place in water or space? These are so exciting questions. Okay, I swear I saw like a galaxy first, Benjamin says. So look at all the things that we kill when we tell them the title of the story. So if you could hide the title of the story, it would be much better, because look at all the things that are coming out of your brains now. So I like at the top, etc., etc. Now, yes, Maria Virginia has made another question. Why is the champagne behind bars? Oh, so you are noticing that apparently there are bars in front of the champagne. So we can start wondering, where is the celebration taking place if there are bars? So these are all the things you can do before you even start talking about something related to science, history, literature, whatever it is you're going to teach. Predicting. Let me share with you the name of the book. It's called The Lottery Winner. The name of the book is called The Lottery Winner, and the person who wins the lottery is behind the bars. He's in jail. So basically, this is what the cover is talking about. Now, let's move on to the kind of activity you could do while reading, during reading a story, okay? In general, when the story, when the book has pictures, we tend to ask, what can you see in the picture? Let us improve a little bit on that, and let us use all the senses here. What can you hear in this picture? What can you smell? What can you taste? What can you touch? Okay, so I'm giving you a couple of seconds for you to think of multisensory information that is coming to your brain through your eyes. I understand that. But it is a more complex question than simply asking, what can you see? Cheering, says Virginia, okay. Resigning. I like what you said, resigning. So let me go back to the chat. For Benjamin, hold on. Resigning from a toxic job. This is Lourdes, terrific. So you are making here already an analogy between whatever is going on in the story, and maybe this is a person who is celebrating that he or she has just resigned from a toxic job. Doria says she can listen to music, probably laughter, chatter, smell of food, different perfumes. Yes, Benjamin is definitely smelling the alcohol. Sorry if that's rude. No, it isn't. We are in a celebration. Party mood. Oh, I like this one. I didn't ask you about the mood. What is the mood in this picture? Very good, terrific. So look at all the things you can ask when you talk about all the senses, and not only what can you see, okay? And trying to read all. Why policemen? So here we have more questions. What's going on here? We're in the middle of a celebration and there are policemen. So it's interesting to see how, while we are describing a multisensory environment, we have questions popping up. Excitement, a well-mannered gentleman. Danger, Carmen says. I assume Carmen is feeling danger because it's strange to have those 2 policemen like standing by the door, okay? So this is the kind of thing you can do while you're reading the story, but not only what can you see, but what can you listen, what can you touch, what can you feel, and so on. Finally, let's move on to the kind of thing you can do at the beginning, during the reading, and at the end of the reading. And this is a famous KWL chart. What I know about the story, what I want to know about the story, and what I learned about the story. So before you tell a story, whatever the story is about, again, it may be something related to science, to history, to the English lesson. The first thing you can do is, okay, what do you know about the subject? Today, I'm going to be talking about stories. What do you know about stories? So you will write them down in the column. Here, what you are seeing is the first grade teacher talking about professions, and in particular, the vet. So when I was visiting this classroom, I took the picture of the children and the teacher. And because the kids are not all of them writing their names yet, because it's the beginning of the year, the teacher is writing what they suggest. But look at column number 2. Column number 2 is, what do you want to know about the vet? And the list of questions was very long, because there are a lot of stuff that maybe the teacher did not plan and that kids are curious about. And finally, after reading and talking about the vet, you would complete the last column with what I learned. So this is also another strategy, a reading technique that you can use at the beginning, during the lesson, and at the end of the lesson. Finally, what can you do after you read a story, after you talk about a specific period of history, after you read a play or whatever? This is kind of a ladder into a good story. So it's like scaffolding the story. So what you can see is that they have divided each step of the ladder with one of the elements of the story. What's the setting? What are the characters? What's the conflict? And finally, what's the resolution? And this is a very visual way of recapping a story. Other things you can do, and I did in the school that I co-founded, oh my goodness, this was almost 20 years ago. And because I love stories, I would look for excuses to celebrate reading all the time. So one of the things we did was open days. Open days means the school is closed and transformed into, and every classroom would be transformed into a specific story. In this case, what you're seeing here is an entire classroom decorated for Shakespeare's plays. So there they would exhibit and they would act out scenes from Shakespeare. But the nice thing about the open day is that parents are invited and they visit every classroom and they listen to the stories and so on and so forth. And you invite parents as guest speakers to tell stories as well. You could also do that on a specific day, book day. Yes, when we celebrate Shakespeare and Cervantes, April 23rd. What we did on book day is we allowed our students to come to school in a costume, disguised. In the costume, if they were able to, in the costume of their favorite character in a story. So we had a lot of Harry Potters. Of course, I was one of the queens from Shakespeare's plays. And then we have the secretary there that was a witch. And then the secretary was one of the ladies, but the man in the middle, who was the, how do you call this, el celador, who was in charge of discipline, was one of the witches. And it's very exciting to have the entire school dressed up as their favorite character. And of course, after reading a story, the ideal thing would be to go and tell the story to somebody else. So to do storytelling by bringing the students in secondary school to tell the story to the youngsters, or the other way around. So these are all fantastic post-reading activities. So let's have another mini break before I do the final part of this talk. This mini break doesn't have to do with true and false or moving. It is a more intrapersonal activity. And it has a picture of some books leaning on a shelf. And I want you to draw them, if you have there a piece of paper, draw the books and write the title of the books that inspire you. So this is also a pause for the brain to recover energy, oxygen flowing, blood flowing, while I play music. which are those sources of inspiration? Which are the books that you tend to reread every now and then? Which are the books that maybe encouraged you to be a teacher? Which are the books that maybe encourage you to be a speaker on brain and learning? So this is an activity that you can do as a pause between explaining something and explaining something else, okay? Let's move on to the last topic of our talk, which is stories as a means to teach critical thinking. Now, this is a very ancient cover of time, but it is useful to remind us how important the skills for the new millennium are, and to make sure that we are teaching them in schools. So thinking outside the box is one of those soft skills that employers are hoping to find in the candidates who come searching for a job. So how can you help people think outside the box? Well, first of all, how can you help your students think to begin with? So let's talk about that, how stories can help you to teach thinking, okay? So one of my favorites in the world is Howard Gardner in this amazing book, which is quite old. It's more than 10 years old. And he says that this world we are living in needs a different kind of instruction. A different kind of instruction, meaning not simply feeding people with knowledge, spoon feeding them with knowledge, but it's a different kind of world that needs a different kind of disciplining of the mind. So resist oversimplification and prepare your students to embrace the complexity of the modern world. For example, how are we going to do our teaching point now that something like artificial intelligence exists? How are we going to teach them writing now that ChatGPT exists? So we need to start thinking different ways of teaching and different ways of making the mind become more and more expert on thinking. But how do you teach thinking? So I'm going to share with you some of the findings from Gail Gregory and Terence Parry in this book, Designing Brain-Compatible Learning. So the huge thing to understand when you're teaching thinking is that thinking has to do with two other important topics, which are the climate or the atmosphere in which the thinking is going to happen. And it has to do with the skills that have to do with thinking that we are not born with. We need to be taught how to solve problems, how to know the difference between something that is fake and something that is true in the internet, and so on and so forth. And thinking also has to include this process of thinking about my own thinking, metacognition. Whenever you teach people something, you need to make them aware of the fact that, yes, I was able to finish this in time. Why? What were my brilliant spots? What should I improve on? Why did it work? Why didn't it work? So very briefly, I'm going to give you examples to foster each one of these different angles of the triangle. The climate for critical thinking needs to be a climate with absence of threat. The brain will not turn on the thinking cap, the cognitive brain, if it is under stress, if it is afraid of the teacher, if it believes they will laugh at my answer, and so on and so forth. So if you want to develop thinking, the first thing you need to do is to build the proper environment for thinking. And this will have to do with open, free of threat climates that promote learning, where we celebrate mistakes, where we understand that everybody is clever in a different way. Here, the picture that I'm showing you is what we do at the end of a month, or the theme in a book, or a particular story. We celebrate the learning by asking students to complete this chart that says, what did you learn from this story or from the month that I was teaching you? What do you imagine for the next term? How did you feel with the different activities I used, and which were the activities you enjoyed the most? So when you ask your students for feedback, it is a way of telling them, you are very important. I want to listen to your opinion. And this is a way of establishing open, two-way communication classrooms. How can you develop the skills for thinking? Let me go to the chat is kind of burning, so I want to make sure. Oh, okay. Let me know if there is anything I need to know from the chat box, because I'm seeing something else. Okay, the short story, blah, blah, blah. Okay. How can you teach skills? Okay, so here one of the ways in which you can teach thinking is through graphic organizers. Maybe you are familiar with Harvard, Project Zero, and Visible Thinking. And what they are doing in Harvard is giving us different graphic organizers that can shape the thinking process. So through those graphic organizers, it's like we can even see how we start from scratch by maybe what can you see in the picture, but then we move on to what does this make you think about, and finally, what do you wonder? Here, what I asked my students was that day, secondary school again, when do they believe that the school gives them choices throughout the day? When do they feel that they have the option of choosing? So here, what you can see is something that we call divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is like a brainstorming, coming up with as many answers as you can. So in this case, they were telling me every time that we have an oral presentation and you allow us to choose whether it's going to be with PowerPoint or whatever, every time we work in centers, every time you let us change the seating arrangement. So this is one kind of thinking, divergent thinking. Another kind of thinking, we move on, could be this exercise we're going to do together, which is called convergent thinking. And this is what we need to teach. Let's teach them how to think divergent and convergently, okay? It's like the skimming and scanning in a book. So before we finish, we are almost 10 minutes away, a little bit less. This is also an activity for thinking. It's a routine for thinking that is called PIN. So far, almost 50 minutes since we began. What is positive about this talk? What is interesting about this talk? What is negative about this talk? So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds, please. You can turn on your mic or share in the screen. So far, we've talked about why stories are brain compatible. We've talked about what to do at the beginning and at the end of telling a story, story techniques. And we have talked about teaching people how to think through storytelling. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds. What is positive about today's theme and today's presentation? What's interesting? What's negative? As you can see, you can use this visual routine for anything. You read a story. What was positive about such a character, interesting and negative? You tell them about, I don't know, the War of the Roses in history. What was positive about it? What was interesting, etc. So you can use this to summarize almost everything. Chat box. Interesting that storytelling is a whole brain activity. Yes. Thank you, Abigail.
Okay. I think Mubarak also raised his hands. Maybe he wants to say something.
Hello to all. Hello to all. I'm Mubarak Ali from India. Here the time is, it's an early morning, 12:30, madam. The 1 hour is passed like I couldn't how to express my words. Thanks for making us activate in the early morning, madam. It's really insightful sessions. So as per your questions, what the things are the takeaway? No, the stories tells purpose, missions, people, and authenticities. So these are my takeaways from these sessions, madam. And thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. And a big hug from here, Argentina to India.
Thanks a
Thank
lot,
you for
madam.
sharing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Margarita says that the positive thing, I'm going to go back, is we can help students feel better and learn about themselves through stories. Interesting, the techniques. Negative, we are running out of time. Yes, I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much for sharing. I won't be listening to all the rest of the sharing, so I can finish and wrap it up. But take this activity home also, this way of wrapping up through the PIN visual routine, okay? Finally, then, let's go. Sometimes I don't have time for this. Okay, let me very briefly give you the idea. Also, when you want people to think, the highest form of thinking is to create something with what you are learning, is to use the information you've learned and to apply it to your own life. So things you can ask people once you've read a story tale is, what if Juliet did not drink the potion, for example? What if the English had won the battles in Argentina? Now, of course, this has nothing to do with guessing. This is basing what you have read and understood, and according to that, giving another end to the story. Okay, so this is a funny one from, of course, Roald Dahl. What the Sleeping Beauty would have given her right arm for. What if the Sleeping Beauty didn't want to marry the prince? What if she wanted something else? It says she was a brunette beauty and a genius of a brain. She refused marriage. She inherited everything by primogeniture, so she didn't need the money. And the country's economy prospered under her rule. So when the handsome prince came by on his white charger, she bought it from him and started her own racehorse business. So this is the kind of thing you can do with stories. Ask them to change the title, to change the end of the story, to change the whole philosophy of the story. And finally, one of the things I used a lot, primary and secondary, is the 6-word story that is generally apparently related to Hemingway. Apparently Hemingway was the first person who wrote a story using only 6 words. And this was the story that Hemingway wrote. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. I guess you can realize that there is a whole story behind those 6 words. So what you can also do is use 6-word stories to have people talking about what they mean. One of the most heartbreaking 6-word stories, I still make coffee for 2. So what could have happened here? Who is the I? Who is the other person? You can do thousands of things with the 6-word stories. And this is the link you can go to find many, many more 6-word stories. So the ultimate thing would be to have them writing the stories, because so far we've been reading them stories and they've been listening to stories. And now they can write, or they can make a PowerPoint with their 6-word stories. I'm just going to show you a little bit of it, okay? Only 6 words.
I need to get my story straight. My friends are in the bathroom getting higher than the Empire State. My lover, she's waiting for me just across the bar. My seat's been taken by some sunglasses, asking about a scar. And I know I gave it to you months ago. I know you're trying to forget, but between the drinks and subtle things, though.
The point here was to write a story, or they were also allowed to write like a leitmotif by using 6 stories, 6 words to describe who they are. So using stories also to express yourselves, okay? Finally, recapping. And the way I want to recap is by telling you more about this. We need to use varied teaching methods. There's a lot of research on this. I'm writing the name of the authors if you want to know more about them, by presenting material using different types of learning modalities, by using and making the most of our teacher's tone of voice. Our teacher's tone of voice is the one that will bring in the emotional brain, and it will tell also the thinking cortex, come on, it's time for a story. And every time you use your voice and you use a variety of different teaching methods, you are reducing the levels of stress of your students. So far from only being teaching a topic or a subject, you're doing so much more by making that person feel well. So if you're ready, we are going to finish with this beautiful poem that is called Tell Me a Story. And it goes like this. I'm going to put the music in the background, if I can find a way of doing that. I don't know why it's not activated. So tell me a story. Set me free in the land of thorn-walled castles and the magic number 3. 3 bears, 3 pigs, 3 billy goats, and wishes always 3. Tell me your story. I must know the things you used to like to do and where you used to go. What made you laugh and cry so many years ago? Tell me a story. Let me see the laughing tiny baby that I used to be. Tell me why I'm special and of the love you have for me. And when you have told those stories, tell me more. The world is full of stories. We have just opened the door. Thank you so much. Thank you for being there on the other side of the screen. I hope you're taking home ideas to go on reading stories and to make them part of your daily lessons.
Thank you, Lucre, for joining us today. I don't know if there is anybody who wants to ask a question before we continue, because now that Lucrecia got us all excited about storytelling, I'm going to chime in with her and I'm going to share a story with you guys. Okay, so is there any question? Let me stop the recording for a second.